In the quiet suburbs of Springfield, Massachusetts, in April of 1995, police discovered something that would haunt the city for the next 3 years. The body of 45-year-old Vera Hallams lay in her apartment, bound with electrical cords, beaten and strangled. She was a mother of 4, living alone, and whoever had killed her had done so with methodical brutality. Police had no leads, no suspects, just the horrifying evidence of what appeared to be a senseless murder. What they didn't know was that they had just found the first victim of one of Massachusetts' most prolific serial killers. The man responsible for Vera's death and 8 others wouldn't be caught for another 3 years. His name was Alfred Gainor, and by the time authorities finally arrested him, he had terrorized an entire city and shattered countless lives. Yet despite his devastating impact, Alfred Gainor was responsible for the murder of 9 women in Springfield, Massachusetts, yet he remains relatively unknown. This is part of our series examining some of the most evil serial killers you've likely never heard of. Today, we begin with Alfred Gainor, a predator who stalked the streets of Springfield for years, followed by Cleophas Prince Jr., known as the Claremont Killer, who terrorized San Diego, Robert Joseph Silveria Jr., the deadly hobo who rode America's railways, leaving a trail of bodies, Joseph Edward Burgess, the religious zealot turned fugitive killer, and James Edward Poe, whose shooting spree shocked Florida. These are the monsters who operated in the shadows, their names absent from the headlines despite their horrific crimes. Alfred Gainor was born December 10th, 1966, in Springfield, Massachusetts. Gainor, a former handyman and crack addict, worked odd jobs in the 1990s. To his neighbors and co-workers, he appeared unremarkable, just another face in the crowd struggling to get by. But beneath that ordinary exterior was something much darker. He met several of his victims in a mutual search for crack cocaine and robbed some for drug money after strangling and raping them. From 1995 to 1998, he murdered 9 women between the ages of 20 and 45 in Springfield, Massachusetts. What made Gainor particularly dangerous was his method of selecting victims. The former handyman targeted vulnerable women, often those struggling with addiction or engaged in sex work. These were women society often overlooked, women whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. His killing pattern was as disturbing as it was calculated. His modus operandi involved strangling his victims after subjecting them to sexual assault and robbery. But Gainor didn't just kill his victims. He posed their bodies in grotesque displays designed to shock whoever found them. Police and prosecutors say he robbed some for drug money, raped most of his victims, and often posed their bodies grotesquely to shock whoever found them, which in several cases happened to be the victims' young children. The horror of what these children witnessed cannot be overstated. 3 of the women's bodies were found by their children. Imagine the trauma of a young child discovering their mother's lifeless body, arranged by a killer who wanted to maximize the psychological damage of his crimes. This wasn't just murder, it was a deliberate attempt to traumatize the living. One of the most chilling aspects of Gainor's crimes was revealed in the case of Amy Smith. Amy Smith, 20, found in her apartment on July 11th, 1996, with her 22-month-old daughter, Destiny Smith, who died of starvation and dehydration. This innocent toddler was left alone with her mother's corpse, slowly dying of starvation and dehydration while Gainor continued his killing spree. The image of that helpless child trapped in an apartment with her dead mother, waiting for help that would come too late, represents the ultimate evil of Gainor's actions. As the body count mounted, police began to notice patterns. On June 15th, 1997, Gainor met 34-year-old drug addict Jill Ann Ermelini near her home. Having lured the woman to a parking lot under the pretense of selling her drugs, he attacked her, strangling and robbing her, before hiding her body in a truck. On October 24th, Gainor met another drug addict, 29-year-old Robin M. Atkins. After using cocaine together while in a drugged state, Gainor attacked Atkins, beating and raping her. Soon after, he strangled her to death, stealing money and other valuables from her wallet. The violence escalated as Gainor grew bolder. On October 31st, Gainor met 38-year-old Joanne C. Thomas. Once in her apartment, Gainor sodomized and subsequently strangled her, leaving his fingerprints and semen on the crime scene. By this point, he was leaving evidence, becoming careless in his arrogance. But even more shocking was what happened next. 2 weeks later, on November 14th, Gainor went to the house of his longtime girlfriend, 33-year-old Yvette Torres. While they were abusing alcohol and drugs together, Gainor attacked Torres late in the evening, during which he strangled her. After the murder, Gainor stole a video cassette recorder from her house, as well as a number of other items, all of which he later sold. Yvette Torres wasn't just another victim. She was someone who had trusted Gainor, who had let him into her home and her life. This murder revealed the true depth of his depravity. He could kill anyone, even those closest to him, without hesitation or remorse. The fact that he immediately stole her belongings and sold them showed his complete disconnection from any normal human emotion. The killing continued into 1998. On February 1st, 1998, Gainor went to a crack house to purchase narcotics. That evening, he met 38-year-old Loretta Daniels, who agreed to have sex with him in exchange for drugs. Several blocks away, Gainor strangled Daniels in an alley, after which he sodomized her corpse, leaving semen traces on her. Her body was discovered the following day. The necrophilia aspect of this murder showed that Gainor's crimes had reached a new level of depravity. He wasn't just killing to feed his rage or to rob his victims. He was using their bodies to satisfy his twisted sexual desires, even after death. This marked him as one of the most dangerous types of serial killers, one for whom the victim's death was not the end, but part of the sexual gratification. Gainor repeated the process on February 10th, going to the same crack house with the aim of exchanging CDs for crack cocaine. In the evening, he met 42-year-old Rosemary Downs, a drug-addicted prostitute. The two went to Downs' apartment, where they used crack until the early morning. Gainor then raped her, tied her up, and put a gag in her mouth before leaving. Downs later died from suffocation. This murder was particularly cruel because Gainor didn't even stay to watch his victim die. He raped her, bound and gagged her, then simply left, knowing she would slowly suffocate to death while helpless to save herself. The casual cruelty of this act, the way he could inflict such suffering and then walk away, demonstrates the complete absence of humanity in Alfred Gainor. By early 1998, police were closing in. DNA evidence was linking the murders, and based on the results from DNA profiling, Gainor's involvement in the deaths of Rosemary Downs and Joyce Dickerson P. was established, and he was arrested again on April 10th. When they finally caught him, the quiet handyman didn't deny his crimes. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to finally be caught. But even more disturbing than his confession was his attitude about what he had done. At a September 2009 hearing on Fickling's motion for a new trial, Gaynor said he took so long to admit he killed Amy Smith and others because I was embarrassed and I didn't want it to appear that I was a monster, but I came to conclusions that I am. This statement reveals something chilling about Gaynor's mindset. He knew he was a monster, acknowledged it openly, yet continued killing for years. He wasn't driven by delusions or mental illness. He was simply evil, pure and simple. After the death of his 67-year-old mother in 2006, he admitted to the rapes and murders. Gaynor denied guilt before his mother's death because he just couldn't destroy everything she believed in. Even in his confessions, Gaynor's selfishness shone through. He didn't confess to ease the suffering of victims' families or to provide closure. He confessed because his mother, the one person whose opinion still mattered to him, was dead. The families of his victims had suffered for years without answers. Children had grown up not knowing what happened to their mothers, but Gaynor only cared about protecting his mother's image of him. Gaynor was subsequently given 4 sentences of life imprisonment without parole and later received additional life sentences as he confessed to more murders. Police and Assistant District Attorney Carmen Picknally said Gaynor's 8 convictions are the most murders known to be committed by one person in Springfield history and among the most statewide. Today, Alfred Gainor sits in prison, forgotten by most of the world, but not by the families whose lives he destroyed. A vigil was held on Friday evening for Yvette Torres, a murder victim of serial killer Alfred Gainor nearly 30 years ago. These vigils serve as reminders that behind every statistic, every name on a list of victims was a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. The story of Alfred Gainor forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members. His victims were largely women struggling with addiction, women involved in sex work, women living on the margins. When they disappeared, the investigations weren't as thorough, the media coverage wasn't as extensive, and the public outrage wasn't as intense as it might have been for other victims. This societal indifference created the perfect hunting ground for a predator like Gainor. He understood that he could kill these women with relative impunity, that their deaths wouldn't generate the same level of attention or resources as other victims might. This calculated exploitation of society's prejudices makes his crimes even more heinous. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Alfred Gainor case is how easily he blended into normal society. He worked regular jobs, maintained relationships, paid his bills. His neighbors described him as quiet and unremarkable. This ordinariness is what makes serial killers like Gainor so terrifying. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic signs or obvious red flags. Sometimes it looks like the quiet handyman next door, the one who nods politely when you pass on the street. The children who found their mother's bodies will carry those images for the rest of their lives. The families who spent years not knowing what happened to their loved ones suffered a special kind of torment. The women who crossed paths with Gainor and lived can only wonder what small difference in timing or circumstance saved them from becoming victims. Alfred Gaynor's reign of terror lasted 3 years and claimed 9 lives that we know of. Some investigators believe there may have been more victims, women whose disappearances were never connected to him. His case remains a stark reminder that some evil hides in plain sight, masquerading as normalcy while planning the next act of unspeakable violence. As we delve deeper into this series, we'll discover that Gainor's story is not unique. Across America, in cities large and small, monsters have operated in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable and exploiting society's blind spots. Their names may not be household words, but their impact on the communities they terrorized and the families they destroyed is immeasurable. Next time, we'll examine Cleophas Prince Jr., the Claremont killer who brought terror to San Diego in the early 1990s. Like Gainor, Prince targeted vulnerable victims, but his methods and motivations reveal a different kind of evil, one that crossed racial lines and challenged everything law enforcement thought they knew about serial killers. These are the stories that need to be told, not to sensationalize violence, but to remember the victims and to understand the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary places. Because only by understanding these monsters can we hope to recognize them before they claim their next victim. Now, in the year 1990, while the residents of Springfield, Massachusetts were blissfully unaware that Alfred Gainor was beginning his reign of terror, 3,000 miles away in San Diego, California, another predator was just getting started. The sunny beaches and palm-lined streets of America's finest city were about to become hunting grounds for a killer whose crimes would challenge everything law enforcement thought they knew about serial murder. Cleophas Prince Jr. was born July 24, 1967, an American serial killer who was convicted and sentenced to death in 1993 for the rape and murder of 6 women in San Diego County, California. But unlike the typical serial killer profile, Prince would cross racial lines in a way that baffled investigators and shattered their assumptions about criminal behavior. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, Cleophas Prince Jr. joined the United States Navy after graduation. A deceivingly normal background and pleasant disposition led most to believe he would do okay in life and to never suspect his darker cravings. He was described as an average student with an interest in sports, someone who seemed destined for an ordinary, productive life. But beneath that facade of normalcy, something much darker was brewing. After completing high school, he joined the U.S. Navy in 1987. He was stationed at Miramar Naval Air Station in San Diego. It should have been the beginning of a stable career, a chance for a young man from Alabama to see the world and build a future. Instead, it became the first crack in a carefully constructed mask of respectability. Prince's military career was short-lived and marred by misconduct. He faced disciplinary action for stealing a postal money order. What seemed like a minor transgression would prove to be the tip of an iceberg. Cleophas Prince was court-martialed in October 1989 and convicted of larceny. After serving a brief sentence, he was recommended for discharge from the Navy. The dishonorable discharge in October 1989 marked a turning point in Prince's life. Suddenly, the young man who had seemed so promising found himself adrift in San Diego with no job, no prospects, and growing resentment festering inside him. 2 months later, he moved into the Buena Vista Gardens apartment complex, which was close to the location of the first 3 murders. He lived at the Buena Vista complex until May 2, 1990. The choice of Buena Vista Gardens was no coincidence. This apartment complex would become ground zero for a killing spree that would terrorize San Diego for nearly a year. Prince wasn't just looking for a place to live, he was positioning himself in a hunting ground where he could study potential victims, learn their routines, and plan his attacks with methodical precision. Prince's criminal activities escalated dramatically after his discharge from the Navy. Between January and September 1990, he embarked on a terrifying spree of violence in San Diego County. What started as petty theft and burglary would soon evolve into something far more sinister. On January 12th, 1990, Tiffany Schultz, 20, was the first victim murdered on January 12th, 1990, in her Canyon Ridge apartment. Tiffany was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, but she made the fatal mistake of living alone in an area where Prince was hunting. Schultz's boyfriend was initially arrested for her murder, but was released 3 days later. The investigation went cold, and Prince had successfully committed his first murder without detection. The pattern was set. Janine Weinhold, 21, was killed on February 16th in her Buena Vista Gardens home. Again, a young woman living alone, again a brutal stabbing, and again the killer vanished without a trace. Police didn't yet realize they were dealing with a serial killer. Each murder was initially treated as an isolated incident, giving Prince the perfect cover to continue his spree. Holly Suzanne Tarr died April 3rd, 1990, aged 18, was visiting her brother and staying at his Buena Vista Gardens apartment. Tarr's slaying led police to believe a serial killer was stabbing women. Holly was from Michigan, visiting her brother in what should have been a safe, temporary stay. Her death marked the moment when investigators began to see the connections between the murders. A composite drawing of the killer was distributed in April 1990 based on an eyewitness description. A maintenance worker had seen the killer fleeing the Buena Vista Gardens apartment complex following Holly Tarr's death. For the first time, they had a face to go with the terror, but they still didn't know his name or where he might strike next. What made Prince particularly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, but his calculated approach to choosing victims. While serial killers usually target victims of their own race, Cleophas Prince Jr. was an African American who systematically stalked, raped, and murdered white women. This cross-racial targeting was extremely unusual and would later confound criminal profilers who relied on established patterns to track serial killers. In each case, Prince entered the female victim's residence during daylight hours through an unlocked door or window, surprising them during or just after they bathed and stabbing them to death with knives taken from their kitchen. The daylight attacks were particularly bold and showed Prince's confidence in his ability to strike without being detected. He knew that most people expected home invasions to happen at night, so attacking during the day gave him an element of surprise. The choice to use kitchen knives was both practical and psychological. It meant Prince didn't have to bring weapons to the crime scene, reducing his chances of being caught with evidence. But it also added an element of intimacy to the murders, using the victim's own belongings against them in their most private space. Prince struck when he knew his victims would be showering and thus be less attentive to their surroundings. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated predation. Prince had studied his victims enough to know their routines, to understand when they would be most vulnerable. The shower was the perfect time to attack, when his victims would be naked, defenseless, and unable to hear him approaching over the sound of running water. Police also theorized that Prince may have stalked some of his victims, including Pamela Clark, by following them home from a fitness club in the Miramar neighborhood near his former girlfriend's residence. The fitness club connection revealed another layer of Prince's methodology. He wasn't just randomly selecting victims, he was actively hunting them, following them from public spaces to learn where they lived and when they would be alone. Alyssa Naomi Keller died May 21st, 1990, aged 38, lived in the East San Diego apartment complex where Prince moved in May 1990. A gold nugget ring belonging to Keller was traced to Prince. Alyssa's murder showed that Prince was escalating, becoming bolder and more brazen. By moving into the same complex as his victim, he could conduct surveillance right under everyone's noses. The taking of jewelry wasn't just about robbery, it was about trophies. He later bragged about the killings to a friend and took to wearing the dead woman's wedding ring on a chain around his neck. He gave another ring to his girlfriend as a Christmas present after taking it from Tar. This behavior showed the depth of Prince's depravity. He wasn't just killing these women, he was celebrating their deaths, wearing symbols of their lives as badges of his power over them. The most horrific double murder came on September 13th, 1990. Pamela Gail Clark died September 13th, 1990, aged 42, lived in the University City District. Amber Clark died September 13th, 1990, aged 18, also lived in University City with her mother, Pamela. Mother and daughter killed on the same day in their own home. The grief of losing both at once devastated their family and shocked even hardened investigators. At approximately 8 a.m. on September 13th, 1990, Pamela Clark left her home in the University City area of San Diego en route to the family fitness center on Miramar Road. She was wearing a full body glove and a bathing suit. Pamela was following her normal routine, going to exercise as she did regularly. She had no idea that she was being watched, that her predictable schedule had made her a target. Two of Prince's roommates testified he had been in possession of Clark's wedding ring. The ring wasn't just evidence of murder, it was a symbol of a life destroyed, a marriage ended, a family shattered. For Prince to casually possess it and show it to roommates demonstrated his complete disconnection from the humanity of his victims. What made the Clark murders particularly devastating was that at the time the bodies of the Clarks were discovered, Alyssa Keller had not yet been identified as a victim of the same killer. Police were still trying to connect the dots, still hoping they were dealing with isolated incidents rather than a serial killer who was growing bolder with each attack. San Diego police characterized the case as the largest manhunt in the force's history. The pressure was enormous. 6 women were dead, neighborhoods were in panic, and still the killer remained at large. Traditional profiling methods weren't working because Prince didn't fit the expected patterns. Before his arrest, police characterized the then unknown serial killer as a disorganized opportunist for the common patterns in the crimes. In each case, Prince entered the female victim's residence during daylight hours through an unlocked door or window, surprising them during or just after they bathed and stabbing them to death with knives taken from their kitchen. But the authorities were wrong about Prince being disorganized. Turned out, Prince Jr. was one of California's most organized and methodical serial killers. He had simply crafted a method that appeared chaotic while actually being highly planned and executed. This misconception may have cost precious time in the investigation and possibly additional lives. Defendant reported that he enjoyed stalking women and once he selected one, he enjoyed playing with his victims, letting them believe they would escape, and then he would do them. Defendant also reported that he enjoyed watching blood drip from a knife onto the victim's pubic area. These chilling details, revealed later during his trial, showed that Prince derived sadistic pleasure from his crimes. This wasn't killing out of rage or desperation, it was methodical torture for his own gratification. Prince's ability to evade capture for so long stemmed from several factors. His cross-racial victim selection threw off profilers who expected same-race targeting. His daylight attacks contradicted assumptions about when predators struck. His use of victims' own knives meant he left no distinctive weapon signatures, and his normal demeanor meant neighbors and acquaintances never suspected the monster living among them. Prince was caught in February 1991 after he tried to break into a Scripps ranch house. A woman whom he followed home from the Miramar Road Health Club was getting ready to shower when she heard a noise at the front door. She ran from the house and sought help from a neighbor who came and confronted Prince. This attempted break-in would prove to be Prince's downfall. Unlike his previous victims, this woman heard him coming and escaped. Prince claimed he was trying to find a female friend who had entered the woman's home, but eventually gave up and scuttled away. The eyewitnesses took Prince's license plate number and identified him from photographs. The license plate was the thread that unraveled everything. For the first time, investigators had a name to go with the face in their composite drawing. When they began building a case against Prince, the evidence mounted quickly. DNA, fingerprints, witness testimony, and the stolen jewelry all pointed to one conclusion: they had found the Claremont killer. After 6 hours of telephone conversations, Prince walked into the precinct with his mother and was taken into custody. He was extradited to San Diego, where the trial was held. Even at the end, Prince maintained the facade of cooperation, walking into the police station as if he had nothing to hide. Prince was found guilty on July 13, 1993, on all 6 counts of first-degree murder and 21 other felony charges. After later deliberations, the jury rendered a verdict of death, which the judge handed down on November 5, 1993. Justice had finally been served, but it could never bring back the 6 women whose lives had been cut short. Prince is serving his sentence on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He sits there today, nearly 35 years after his first murder, still alive, while his victims remain forever young in the memories of those who loved them. The case of Cleophas Prince Jr. forced law enforcement to reconsider their assumptions about serial killers. His cross-racial targeting, his daylight attacks, his organized methodology disguised as chaos all challenged conventional wisdom. Most importantly, his crimes reminded investigators that evil doesn't always come in the package they expect. The women Prince killed were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They had dreams, ambitions, people who loved them. Tiffany Schultz was only 20 years old. Holly Tarr was visiting her brother, excited about her trip to California. Alyssa Keller was building a life in San Diego. Pamela Clark was a devoted mother, and her daughter Amber was just 18, with her whole future ahead of her. Prince's capture brought relief to San Diego, but it couldn't erase the trauma he had inflicted on the community. He mercilessly held San Diego on edge and in great fear for over a year, until finally being apprehended during a burglary in Alabama. For months, women had lived in fear, checking their locks, avoiding being alone, wondering if they would be next. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Every woman in San Diego had to wonder if the killer was watching her, following her home from the gym, learning her routine. The trust that people have in their daily lives, the assumption that they are safe in their own homes, was shattered. What makes Prince's story particularly disturbing is how normal he appeared to those around him. As investigators learned more about Prince, they heard many acquaintances say that he was a polite young man, and that despite growing up in a rough neighborhood in Alabama, the oldest of 8 children, he'd never had a brush with the law and had stayed away from gangs. Even his family couldn't believe what he had done. That crime spree is the work of a psycho person. Prince Sr. was quoted in the San Diego Union Tribune, someone who has no mind to think. He couldn't imagine that his son could do such things. The boy had always been polite and obedient, he insisted. There had to be some mistake. I imagine he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This denial from his father illustrates how completely Prince had hidden his true nature. To his family, he was still the polite, obedient boy they had raised. They couldn't reconcile that image with the monster who had terrorized San Diego. But that's exactly what made Prince so dangerous, his ability to maintain 2 completely different personas. The Claremont killer case serves as a stark reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can be polite young men with military service records. They can be the neighbor who nods hello on the street. They can be someone who seems completely ordinary until the moment they decide to take a life. Prince's victims trusted that their homes were safe spaces, that daylight meant safety, that their routines were private. He exploited every one of those assumptions, turning normal life into a hunting ground. His legacy is not just 6 murders, but the knowledge that safety is often an illusion, and evil can hide behind the most ordinary face. Today, Prince remains on death row, another name on the long list of monsters who thought they could kill with impunity. But his victims are not forgotten. Their names, their stories, and their stolen futures serve as reminders of the precious nature of life and the importance of never letting our guard down against those who would destroy it. The story of Cleophas Prince Jr. proves that serial killers come in all forms, that racial assumptions can be deadly wrong, and that sometimes the most organized killers are those who appear the most chaotic. In our next installment, we'll examine another killer who operated in plain sight, using America's railway system as his hunting ground and leaving a trail of bodies across the country. In the rusted underbelly of America's sprawling railway system, where steel tracks crisscross the continent like arteries pumping the lifeblood of commerce, something evil took root in the 1990s. For 15 years, Robert Joseph Silveria Jr. rode the rails, killing fellow freight train riders throughout the United States. He is also known as Sidetrack. But unlike the serial killers who stalked city streets or suburban neighborhoods, Silveria operated in a world that most Americans never see, a shadow realm of freight trains, hobo jungles, and forgotten people. Robert Joseph Silveria was born on March 3, 1959, in Redwood City in California, United States of America. He was born second of 4 children and raised by both parents. He was raised as a middle child and had 1 sister, 2 brothers, 1 half-brother. His upbringing seemed ordinary enough. His father worked in the catering department of an airline. His mother, a supervisor of an airline. But beneath the veneer of a middle-class California childhood, something was festering. Robert Joseph Silveria was physically abused at some point of his life. The details of that abuse remain murky, but its effects would echo across decades and cost dozens of innocent lives. By the time he reached adulthood, Silveria had become something entirely different from the boy his parents had raised. In 1981, age 21/22, Robert Joseph Silveria started his killing spree. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to rob, murder his victims. But what made Silveria particularly deadly wasn't just his willingness to kill, it was the world he chose to inhabit. Suspected of being the boxcar murderer, Bob was part of the Freight Train Riders of America, a boxcar gang that preys upon fellow rail-riding hobos. The Freight Train Riders of America, known as the FTRA, was unlike any criminal organization law enforcement had encountered before. The FTRA is sometimes claimed to have been founded by a group of Vietnam veterans in 1984 in a Montana bar. These veterans began riding freight trains after being unable to make a transition back to civilian society. What started as a support network for damaged men soon became something much darker. A little-known criminal syndicate called the Freight Train Riders of America, FTRA, has an estimated membership of 2,500 to 5,000 transients and may be responsible for many homicides and other crimes along the country's railroad systems. They weren't urban gang members fighting over street corners or drug dealers protecting territory. They were nomads riding America's 140,000 miles of freight tracks, invisible to most of society and accountable to no one. There are three main factions of the FTRA. They are distinguished by geographical rails and bandana color. Lowriders ride the rails in the South, from Texas to California, and wear red bandanas around the neck. Midriders ride the rails across the Midwest and wear blue bandanas, and high riders ride the rails from Minnesota to Northern California, wearing black bandanas. This color-coded system wasn't just for identification, it was a hierarchy of violence and fear. Silveria operated primarily with the high riders, those who wore the black bandanas and were considered the elite of this murderous organization. Silveria was a scarecrow-looking heroin addict who had a tattoo of the word freedom on his throat. The irony of that tattoo would not be lost on his victims. For them, encountering Silveria meant the end of all freedom, forever. Sidetrack traveled at will, with no record of his movements, and his pool of victims were the unhoused, the drifters, and the fellow rail hoppers he encountered. People on the fringe, the kind who wouldn't be missed. This was the perfect hunting ground for a predator like Silveria. His victims lived outside society's safety net, men and women who had already been forgotten by family, friends, and the system. The victim vagabonds were commonly shot in the head at close range with a small caliber pistol while they slept in homeless encampments at night. The suspect had to be one of them because he knew the camps and was apparently able to closely approach these wary travelers for a point-blank shot to the head. But Silveria's methods weren't limited to gunshots. The victims, mostly drifters, were stabbed or bludgeoned to death and robbed of their meager possessions. But mostly he preyed on the helpless homeless, killing them for their clothing and social security cards. These weren't crimes of passion or rage. They were cold, calculated murders committed for the most pathetic of reasons, stealing the few possessions of people who had almost nothing. Perhaps it was guilt that made him cover the faces of his victims with their clothing. This detail reveals something chilling about Silveria's psychology. Even as he murdered innocent people, some part of him couldn't bear to look at what he had done. Yet that didn't stop him from doing it again and again. The geographic scope of Silveria's crimes was staggering. In the first of 3 interviews, Silveria told Palmini he had killed at least one person in each of 38 states during 14 years riding the rails. Think about that for a moment. 38 states. From coast to coast, border to border, Silverius left a trail of bodies wherever the trains took him. Darren Royal Miller, 19, was found dead in his sleeping bag on July the 8th, 1992, in Thompson Springs, Utah. Miller and 2 friends stopped to party one night near a pond, and Miller was found the following morning with severe head injuries. Though never charged, Silveria was linked to the murder of Miller following his arrest. Darren was just 19 years old, barely an adult, with his whole life ahead of him. He was partying with friends near a pond, probably talking about the future, maybe girls, maybe dreams of what he wanted to do with his life. Then Silveria found him. Michael A. Garfinkel, 20, was found bludgeoned to death on August 2nd, 1994, in Emeryville, California. Garfinkel, originally from Tarzana, recently graduated from Pierce College and was planning to ride boxcars with a friend to Santa Cruz, California. After Silveria confessed, police noted that he had intimate knowledge of the crime. Michael Garfinkel's story is particularly heartbreaking because it shows how Silveria destroyed not just lives, but dreams and innocence. This is what happened to Michael Garfinkel in the summer of 1994. At the time, Garfinkel was a 20-year-old engineering student. Here was a young man who had just graduated college, excited about an adventure with a friend. He probably thought hopping a freight train to Santa Cruz would be romantic, maybe even fun. Instead, he encountered a monster who beat him to death and left his body like garbage. Roger Lee Bowman, 38, was found dead on April 21st, 1995, in Salt Lake City, Utah. Bowman was last seen walking his dog along the train tracks. Police had already identified Silveria as a suspect before he confessed to beating and stabbing Bowman, but they were looking for him using the alias Brad Foster. Roger Bowman's murder shows another aspect of Silveria's predatory nature. Here was a man simply walking his dog, something millions of people do every day without thinking twice about safety. But the railroad tracks were Silveria's domain, and anyone who wandered into that world risked becoming his next victim. James E. McLean, 50, was found stabbed to death on July 23, 1995, in his shack at a homeless encampment in Albany, Oregon. Silveria confessed he met McLean walking along the railroad tracks near his shack. After McLean was murdered, Silveria stole his money. James McLean was trying to survive in one of society's forgotten corners, living in a homeless encampment, just trying to get by day to day. Then Silveria killed him and took what little money he had. Charles Randall Boyd, 46, was found bludgeoned to death on July 28, 1995, in a collapsed tent in a Canopolis Lake campground. Boyd met Silveria in El Paso, Texas, while Boyd was building a bunkhouse for a youth ranch, and later traveled with him to Kansas. Charles Boyd was doing honest work, building a bunkhouse for a youth ranch, helping kids have a better life. He made the fatal mistake of trusting Silveria and traveling with him. That kindness cost him his life. Paul Wayne Matthews, 43, was found dead on October 15th, 1995, in a homeless encampment outside Whitefish, Montana. Following his arrest on March 2nd, 1996, Silveria confessed to killing Matthews. Another life cut short in another forgotten corner of America, another family that would never know what happened to their loved one until years later. William Avis Pettit Jr., 39, was found bludgeoned to death on December 3rd, 1995, in a boxcar in Millersburg, Oregon. Michael Andrew Kleitz, 24, was found bludgeoned to death on December 5th, 1995, in Portland, Oregon. At the time of Silveria's arrest, he was found with Pettit's backpack, social security card, birth certificate, food stamps, and hair beads. The fact that Silveria was carrying William Pettit's personal documents when he was arrested shows the calculated nature of his crimes. He wasn't just killing these people, he was stealing their identities, using their government benefits, literally profiting from their deaths. These weren't heat-of-the-moment murders, they were premeditated acts of evil. Arrested in March 1995 in a rail yard near Sacramento, California, Silveria was charged with the murder of transient William Pettit, found dead in a boxcar in Northern California. Silveria was arrested without incident March 2nd, 1996, by a Roseville Railroad police officer. When they finally caught him, Silveria didn't resist or try to run. Silveria, who was carrying a gun he had stolen from a victim, briefly thought of killing the officer, but something stopped him, Palmini writes. The arrest came because law enforcement had finally started connecting the dots. A police detective and prosecutor in Salem, Oregon, unraveled the truth of Silveria's killing spree, which began with a murder in Salem. For years, murders along the railway had been treated as isolated incidents, accidents, or suicides. No one realized they were dealing with a serial killer who used America's rail system as his personal hunting ground. Palmini interviewed him at the Placer County Jail in Auburn, where he readily confessed in great detail to killing McLean. He wanted to clear the slate with God for the old Robert Silveria, Palmini said. He wanted to make peace with God and peace with himself. Even in his confessions, Silveria was thinking about himself, about his own spiritual welfare. There was no mention of remorse for his victims or their families. After his arrest, he confessed to a 5-year nationwide murder spree ranging from Florida to California. He confessed to 14 of the unsolved murders, but investigators believe the real number was much higher. He and other law enforcement officials say group members, primarily Silveria, are responsible for as many as 100 murders along the railroad tracks, including hobos thrown off trains or executed with a machete, axe, or sharp buck knife, and left on tracks at night to be run over by oncoming trains. 100 murders. Let that sink in. 100 human beings, each with their own hopes, fears, dreams, and stories snuffed out by one man and his accomplices. Many of the killings were classified as suicides or accidents. Few ever were registered outside the jurisdictions where they occurred. This was the perfect crime in many ways. The victims were transients, people without fixed addresses or regular contact with family. When they disappeared, nobody looked for them. When their bodies were found, often weeks or months later, they were written off as accidents or suicides. It's easy to kill someone on the rails. Just shove them out of a moving boxcar, Palmini said. By the time the body is found, the killer can be hundreds of miles away. This mobility was Silveria's greatest advantage. Unlike other serial killers who operated in defined geographic areas. He could commit murder in Oregon and be in Texas before the body was even discovered. The FTRA provided Silveria with more than just mobility. It gave him a network of accomplices and a culture that normalized violence. Grandinetti says most carry knives and axe handles they refer to as goonie sticks. Officials have identified a goon squad within the gang that is responsible for many violent attacks. Though little is known about the gang, joining appears to be a violent process involving beatings and rapes. Prospects don urine-soaked FTRA bandanas around their necks in a rowdy ritual, usually fueled by alcohol and methamphetamine. Sometimes they kill each other, Quackenbush said. This wasn't just a loose collection of train riders. It was an organized criminal enterprise with initiation rituals, hierarchies, and a culture of violence that made murder seem routine. FTRA members are predators who will do whatever it takes to survive and do not mind killing people in the process. FTRA members pose a threat to other transients, local communities, rail officers, and other law enforcement officers who have railways in their jurisdiction. Palmini also learned about a shadowy, nearly unknown group of train-hopping killers. He says they're members of the FTRA, Freight Train Riders of America, who wear distinctive bandanas they earn through violent actions. The bandanas weren't just identification, they were trophies, proof that the wearer had committed acts of violence to earn their place in this murderous brotherhood. Graffiti left by members include swastikas and Nazi lightning bolts. But without question, police say, gang members are violent. The white supremacist elements of the FTRA added another layer of hatred to their violence. They weren't just killing for money or thrills. They were killing as part of a twisted ideology that dehumanized their victims. While in custody, Bobby claimed all his kills were gang-related hits. Silveria tried to portray himself as just a soldier following orders, but the evidence painted a different picture. I asked him if he did these things, and he said, "Yes, I guess I just have a deep-rooted rage," said one of Silveria's relatives. This wasn't a man following orders. This was a man who enjoyed killing and found an organization that allowed him to indulge his darkest impulses. The investigation into Silveria and the FTRA revealed just how invisible this world was to most Americans. The FTRA didn't get attention because the victims were people no one cared about or even knew, Grandinetti says. When there were investigations, they usually came up with zero because these people are so transient. Rail riders are difficult to track because they don't have permanent addresses, pay taxes, or work. Investigations into transient deaths are difficult and time-consuming. You can kill a transient and his body may not surface for 2 weeks, Quackenbush said. The suspect, by that time, may be 20 states away. This invisibility was exactly what Silveria and the FTRA counted on. They had found the perfect victims in the perfect environment. People who wouldn't be missed in a world that most of society never sees, with the ability to be hundreds of miles away before anyone even knew a crime had been committed. He would not be the kind of person you would envision as being a killer, and maybe that's why he was so successful, said Morenger, the Placer County Sheriff's lieutenant. He seems like he's reasonably glib and lucid, and maybe if he wasn't killing people, he might be a used car salesman or a newspaper kind of guy. He can be reasonably friendly, but can also go for the throat. This description captures something terrifying about Silveria. He wasn't a raging lunatic or an obviously dangerous person. He was charming, articulate, someone you might actually like if you met him. By outward appearance, he seemed a friendly, talkative fellow who just happened to like to hop freights across the country, police said. This ability to appear normal, even likable, made him incredibly dangerous. He made friends everywhere as he rode the boxcars of America, living on food stamps, drugs, and wile. But Robert Silveria Jr., born in Redwood City, had a deadly edge. Using the anonymous handle of Sidetrack, he killed people and left a trail of bodies along railroad tracks across America. The name Sidetrack was grimly appropriate. He took people's lives and sent them down a sidetrack to nowhere while he continued on his murderous journey across America. For 15 years, he rode the rails as an angel of death, and almost no one knew he existed. He was arrested on March 2nd, 1996, age 36, convicted on January 30th, 1998, age 36, 38, sentenced to life imprisonment at Wyoming Medium Correctional Institution in Torrington, Wyoming, U.S. Robert Joseph Silveria Jr. is a serial killer currently serving a double life sentence in Oregon for the murders of 34 hobos and homeless men. The courts closed the books on Silveria. He's serving life without parole in an Oregon maximum security prison for 2 Oregon murders, with another life sentence awaiting him in Kansas. Today, Silveria sits in prison, forgotten by most of the world, just as his victims were forgotten. But the railroad tracks still run across America, and somewhere out there, other predators may be using those same rails to hunt the vulnerable and the forgotten. Gus Malonis of BNSF said the FTRA and associated act of riding and living on the rails have gone largely extinct. BNSF has commissioned police officers who cracked down on that sort of activity in the late 1980s. Deaths that once numbered near 90 have dropped off precipitously. The increased security and law enforcement attention have made the rails safer, but the story of Robert Joseph Silveria Jr. serves as a reminder of how evil can flourish in society's blind spots. The Boxcar Killer's reign of terror lasted 15 years and claimed at least 14 confirmed lives, though the real number may be much higher. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about who we value as a society and who we're willing to forget. The homeless, the drifters, the forgotten people who ride the rails aren't just statistics or problems to be solved. They're human beings with the same right to life and safety as anyone else. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how Silveria managed to operate for so long in plain sight. He wasn't hiding in caves or abandoned buildings. He was riding the same trains that carry the goods we buy every day, sleeping in rail yards in major cities, moving freely across state lines. The infrastructure of American commerce became his highway to murder, and almost nobody noticed. As we continue examining these forgotten monsters, remember that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it looks like a friendly drifter who just happens to enjoy riding trains. Sometimes it wears the face of someone who might seem likable, even charming, until the moment they decide you've outlived your usefulness. The railroad tracks still stretch across America, carrying freight and commerce from coast to coast. But they also carry the ghosts of Robert Silveria's victims, men and women whose only crime was being vulnerable in a world that had already forgotten them. Their names may not be remembered, but their deaths remind us that monsters can lurk anywhere, even in the places society chooses not to look. Next time, we'll examine Joseph Edward Burgess, a man whose religious convictions twisted into something dark and deadly, proving that evil can hide behind even the most pious facade. His story will show us that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those who believe they're doing God's work. On a quiet Vancouver Island beach in 1972, two young lovers lay sleeping peacefully in their tent, unaware that their unmarked grave would soon become the starting point of one of Canada's longest manhunts. Anne Durrant, a 20-year-old university student, and Leif Carlson, a 21-year-old exchange student from Sweden, had come to this remote corner of British Columbia for a romantic getaway. They had no idea that someone was watching them, someone who saw their unmarried love as an abomination that demanded correction. On June 21st, 1972, Anne Durrant, 20, and Leif Carlson, 21, were shot multiple times in the head at point-blank range as they lay in their sleeping bag on Vancouver Island. The killer had crept up to their tent in the darkness and fired repeatedly into their heads with a .22 caliber rifle, executing them as they slept. It was a cold, calculated act of violence that would haunt investigators for nearly 4 decades. The murderer was Joseph Henry Burgess, circa 1947, July 16, 2009, sometimes referred to as the Cookie Bandit, was an American fugitive and suspected serial killer who, according to authorities, was a religious zealot who sometimes referred to himself as Job, after the biblical figure. Burgess was born in 1946 or 1947 in New Jersey, where he later attended a Jesuit college and occasionally taught religion classes. From the outside, he appeared to be a devout young man, someone who had dedicated his life to understanding and teaching God's Word. But beneath that pious exterior, something dark and twisted was taking root. He fled to Canada in the late 1960s to avoid being drafted into the Vietnam War, after which the Marines put out an active warrant for his arrest. Like thousands of other young American men, Burgess saw the war as unjust and chose exile over military service. But while others who fled to Canada were motivated by pacifism and a desire for peace, Burgess carried violence with him wherever he went. Eventually settling in a Children of God commune on the British Columbia coast, he clashed with other residents due to his religious fervor and rifle ownership. Even among a community of believers, Burgess stood out for his extremism. Lean, with shaggy hair and a beard, he ended many of his sentences with the word Amen. At times he went by the name Job, after the biblical figure tested by God. Burgess eventually made it out to the west coast of Canada, where he lived in a religious commune run by the Children of God and called himself Job, in reference to the biblical figure, but he reportedly was kicked out of the commune's boarding house after his rifle made other residents uncomfortable. The rifle that made his fellow commune members uncomfortable would soon become an instrument of death. Creeley said a woman on the beach told authorities that she had seen Burgess cleaning a .22 caliber rifle and said Burgess had told her he disapproved of Durrant and Carlson's relationship because they were unmarried. This wasn't just a random act of violence. Burgess had studied his victims, learned their habits, and made a deliberate choice to kill them because their lifestyle offended his twisted interpretation of Christian morality. He told the skinny-dipping woman that he did not approve of unmarried people sharing a tent. To Burgess, their love was sin, and sin demanded punishment. Police say he killed them with a .22 caliber rifle, shooting them both point blank in the head as they slept. There was no struggle, no chance to defend themselves. They died instantly, their dreams of a future together ending in a moment of brutal violence. He was gone by the time investigators arrived at the murder scene, but a police dog discovered his belongings, including an identification card and passages from the Bible he had written out, ripped up, and discarded nearby. Even as he fled the scene of his double murder, Burgess couldn't escape his obsession with Scripture. The torn Bible passages found near the crime scene spoke to the contradiction at the heart of his twisted mind. He claimed to serve God while committing the most ungodly acts, leaving behind a fingerprint matched to one taken when he was arrested for failing to report for duty with the U.S. Marine Corps. Mr. Burgess quickly became the prime suspect in the killing, but by then he'd vanished. For nearly 4 decades, he remained out of sight, one of Canada's most wanted criminals. His case featured on the television show America's Most Wanted, his name on an Interpol watch list. The magnitude of Burgess's ability to disappear cannot be overstated. This was 1972, before computers and instant communication made tracking fugitives easier. He had vanished into the vastness of North America, leaving behind only the bodies of 2 innocent young people and a trail that would go cold for decades. He took on a whole new identity, said retired RCMP investigator Dan Creole, who recalls the case as the only one of his career that remained unsolved. We never could find him. But Burgess wasn't finished killing. He is believed to have murdered at least one other young couple in circumstances remarkably similar to the Tofino slayings, before he was finally run to ground in New Mexico last week, shot dead in a gun battle with police while breaking in to a cabin to steal food. 32 years after the Canadian murders on a beach in Northern California, history repeated itself with chilling precision. First on their list was a young couple working at a Christian summer camp who were murdered in their sleeping bag in 2004 on a beach in Northern California. Burgess, a religious zealot who disapproved of relationships between unmarried couples, was a person of interest when Jason Allen, 26, and his fiancée, Lindsay Cutshall, 22, turned up dead 5 years ago on Jenner Beach. Allen, of Zeeland, Michigan, and Cutshall, of Fresno, Ohio, were working at a Christian camp in El Dorado County when their bodies were found in the sleeping bags on a beach in Jenner, California, on August 18, 2004. The parallels were unmistakable. Both couples were shot in the head. Both couples were camping on isolated beaches. Both couples were unwed, which apparently offended Burgess's beliefs. Jason Allen and Lindsay Cutshall were engaged to be married, but to Burgess, their unmarried status made them sinners deserving of death. These weren't random victims. Burgess had chosen them specifically because their relationship represented everything he believed was wrong with the world. Young people living together, expressing love outside the bonds of marriage, defying what he saw as God's law. The Christian camp where Allen and Cutshall worked made their murders even more grotesque. Here were 2 young people dedicating their lives to serving God, working with children, spreading the message of Christ's love. But because they weren't married, Burgess saw them as abominations to be eliminated. His twisted theology had turned him into an avenging angel, dispensing death in the name of righteousness. There is good reason to suspect that there could have very well have been other killings between 72 and 2009 that he became involved in. Investigators believe Burgess may have killed many more people during his 37 years as a fugitive, but the transient nature of his lifestyle and his ability to disappear made it impossible to track all his movements. For decades, Burgess lived like a ghost, moving through the American wilderness without leaving a trace. Burgess is believed to have spent the late 1990s and 2000s burglarizing cabins in New Mexico's Jemez Mountains. During this period, he was nicknamed the Cookie Bandit due to his theft of food, liquor, and survival items. The nickname Cookie Bandit almost makes Burgess sound harmless, like a mischievous character from a children's story. But the reality was far darker. He is believed to have spent the past decade burglarizing cabins in New Mexico's Jemez Mountains, where he was nicknamed the Cookie Bandit for allegedly stealing food, boots, and other goods. The .357 revolver Burgess used in the fight was registered to David Ely, a man whose remains were identified this week by the FBI. Ely was reported missing in April 2006 on a camping trip in the Jemez Mountains. David Ely had been camping in the Jemez Mountains when he encountered Burgess. What should have been a peaceful retreat into nature became a fatal encounter with a killer who had been hiding in those mountains for years. The .357 revolver used to kill Sergeant. Joe Harris was registered to David Ely of New Mexico, who was reported missing in 2007 and was a resident of the area where cabins were being burglarized. Ely's remains were found on August 2, 2009 in the Jemez Mountains. Burgess didn't just steal from his victims, he murdered them and took their possessions, using their own weapons against others. The revolver he used in his final shootout with police had belonged to David Ely, a man he had killed years earlier. This wasn't just theft, it was a form of twisted trophy-taking, keeping mementos of his victims as he continued his murderous spree. The end came on July 16, 2009, when Burgess's luck finally ran out. On July 16, 2009, deputies had been conducting a stakeout to catch the then unidentified thief. After a physical struggle with Burgess, who was attempting to break through the window of a cabin, a gun battle ensued, resulting in the deaths of Burgess and Sergeant Joe Harris. Sergeant Joe Harris was a dedicated law enforcement officer who had spent years tracking the Cookie Bandit, knowing that there was something more dangerous about this cabin burglar than met the eye. "I know my husband didn't die in vain by someone who stole groceries or clothing," Tonya Harris, the slain deputy's widow, told Coet 7, an ABC affiliate in Albuquerque, and he kept saying, "I'm gonna get him. There's something about this guy. He needs to be gotten. There's something about him." Harris had sensed what many others had missed. This wasn't just a petty thief stealing food and supplies. This was a predator who had been living in the mountains for years, surviving by taking what he needed from others and killing anyone who got in his way. His instincts proved tragically correct when the confrontation turned deadly. Deputies conducting a stakeout in hopes of catching the Cookie Bandit were confronted by Burgess, leading to a gun battle that left him and Sergeant Joe Harris dead. After 37 years as a fugitive, Joseph Henry Burgess died as he had lived, in violence and without remorse. In death, Burgess finally revealed the scope of his crimes. Police believe Burgess may have been responsible for other unsolved murders committed between 1972 and 2009. Investigators in Canada and California now are looking to New Mexico for information, such as a diary or people with whom Burgess had contact, that could tie him to their cold cases and possibly others. The case of Joseph Henry Burgess forces us to confront the dangerous intersection of religious extremism and violence. Though he may have played the part of a preacher, police in the United States and Canada believe Mr. Burgess was a cold-blooded killer who used a twisted interpretation of religion to justify his crimes. Burgess represents a particular type of killer, one who uses religious conviction to justify the most unholy acts. He wasn't driven by sexual desire or financial gain like many serial killers. His motivation was ideological, a perverted sense of righteousness that convinced him he was doing God's work by eliminating those he deemed sinful. The tragedy of Burgess's crimes extends beyond the immediate victims. Anne Durant and Leif Carlson were young people in love, looking forward to a future together. Jason Allen and Lindsay Cutshall were engaged to be married, dedicating their lives to serving others at a Christian camp. David Ely was simply trying to enjoy the natural beauty of New Mexico's mountains. All of them died because one man's interpretation of morality had become so twisted that he saw murder as righteousness. Although known for his religious fervor, Mr. Burgess had apparently been conflicted in the lead-up to the crime that sent him on the run. Mr. Creole told of him making an awkward and unsuccessful pass at a nude swimmer, all the while quoting to her from the Old Testament. An old photo shows him flashing a peace sign, looking every inch the free love hippie, but he told the skinny-dipping woman that he did not approve of unmarried people sharing a tent. Under those contradictions lurked the hard edge of his interpretation of theology. This contradiction reveals the complexity of Burgess's pathology. He was attracted to the free love culture of the 1960s and 1970s, yet simultaneously repulsed by it. He quoted scripture while making sexual advances, embodying the very sins he claimed to oppose. This internal conflict manifested as violence against those who represented the temptations he couldn't resist. Burgess's story serves as a chilling reminder that some of the most dangerous killers are those who believe they're serving a higher purpose. Unlike killers driven by obvious pathologies, Burgess saw himself as righteous, chosen by God to eliminate sin from the world. This made him particularly dangerous because he felt no guilt, no remorse, only the satisfaction of completing what he saw as divine work. The families of his victims spent decades without answers, not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead, not understanding why they had been targeted. Said retired RCMP investigator Dan Creeley, who recalls the case as the only one of his career that remained unsolved. For Creeley and other investigators, the Burgess case represented the ultimate failure, a killer who had escaped justice for nearly 4 decades. Today, Joseph Henry Burgess is remembered not as the righteous warrior he believed himself to be, but as what he truly was, a dangerous predator who used religion to justify his taste for violence. His victims are remembered for what they were, innocent people whose only crime was loving someone without the benefit of marriage, or simply being in the wrong place when a killer was hunting. The mountains of New Mexico are quiet now, the cabins safe from the cookie bandit who terrorized them for so many years. But the memory of Joseph Henry Burgess serves as a warning that evil can hide behind the most sacred facades, and that some monsters convince themselves they're angels right up until the moment they're finally stopped. Next time, we'll examine James Edward Poe, whose shooting spree in Florida shocked the nation and proved that sometimes the most dangerous killers are those who appear to be ordinary citizens pushed to their breaking point. His story will show us that evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it erupts in broad daylight, turning everyday places into scenes of unimaginable horror. On the scorching morning of June 18th, 1990, in Jacksonville, Florida, the air conditioning hummed quietly in the offices of General Motors Acceptance Corporation on Bay Meadows Way. 85 employees were settling into what they thought would be another ordinary Monday, processing car loan payments and handling the mundane paperwork of auto financing. Customers trickled in to make their monthly payments. The phones rang with routine inquiries, and coffee grew cold in forgotten mugs. No one could have imagined that within minutes, this unremarkable office building would become the site of one of Florida's most devastating mass shootings, or that the quiet man walking through the front door with a duffel bag would transform their workplace into a slaughterhouse. James Edwards Pop Pooh was born February 16th, 1948, and was an American spree killer who killed 11 people in 2 separate attacks in Jacksonville, Florida on June 17th and 18th, 1990 other killers we've examined in this series. Pooh wasn't a calculating predator who stalked victims for years, or a drifter who moved from place to place. He was something far more terrifying, an ordinary man who lived next door, worked a steady job, and seemed completely normal until the moment he decided that if his world was ending, he would take as many people with him as possible. James Edward Pooh was born on February 16th, 1948, and was the first of 9 children. Pooh grew up in an area near Florida Community College at Jacksonville. As a child, Pooh suffered from asthma, and he had a close relationship with his mother, whom he helped out a lot after his father left the family in 1959. From the outside, Pooh's early life seemed unremarkable, even admirable. He had to take care of his family members since he was a child himself, forever the most reliable and responsible person in his family even as a child. But beneath this facade of responsibility, something darker was taking shape. He attended a vocational school, but dropped out in his sophomore year. At the age of 18, he began working as a common laborer, which he continued until his death. According to former schoolmates, Pooh had affiliations with street gangs during his time at school. Even as a teenager, violence was becoming a language Pooh understood all too well. He was arrested twice in 1965 for vagrancy, and twice again in 1966, once for attempted robbery and a second time for assault after he attacked a construction worker who owed him a quarter. Think about that for a moment. Pooh was willing to assault someone over 25 cents. This wasn't poverty-driven desperation. This was a man whose relationship with violence was fundamentally different from most people's. The first real glimpse into Pooh's capacity for lethal violence came in 1971. On May 8th, 1971, Pooh got into an argument with his best friend, David Lee Pender, who had called his girlfriend a bitch. In the following scuffle, Pooh grabbed a .38 caliber revolver from his girlfriend's purse and shot Pender 3 times, who eventually died in a hospital. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment accident. Pooh had to reach for his girlfriend's purse, pull out a gun, aim it at his best friend, and pull the trigger 3 times. 3 separate decisions to kill the person who knew him best. According to relatives, Pooh never managed to get over the fact that he had killed his friend. But rather than seeking help or making amends, this guilt seemed to fester inside him for nearly 2 decades. The justice system failed catastrophically in its handling of Pooh's case. Pooh was initially charged with murder, though the charge was later reduced to manslaughter. In the end, he pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and was sentenced to 5 years probation, but the judgment of his guilt was withheld by the court subject to the successful completion of probation. He had pleaded guilty to aggravated assault for shooting a man to death in 1971, but the judge allowed his record to be erased after 5 years probation. But Pooh was not technically a convicted felon, Assistant State Attorney John Delaney said. This legal loophole would prove deadly. It was also ruled that Pooh should never be allowed to own a gun due to his violent behavior in the past, though this was never forwarded to police. As a result, Pooh was not considered a felon and therefore was able to purchase several handguns, among them the Room RG 31.38 caliber revolver he later used to commit suicide. The system designed to protect society from dangerous individuals had instead given Poe a clean slate and legal access to the weapons he would use to commit mass murder. After 1971, Poe seemed to settle into what appeared to be a normal life. At the age of 18, he began working as a common laborer, which he stayed until his death, though he earned a reputation as a very reliable worker, and his business agent would later describe him as one of their best, somebody who was never late. He worked out with weights and bet at the dog track. He had few visitors, never threw parties, did not appear to drink, and seemed to work even on weekends. Poe usually left for work about 6:30 a.m. with his hard hat, a cooler, and a thermos, and returned home about 4 p.m. He was working in construction maintenance at an Anheuser-Busch brewery for a local firm, and last May received a 20-cent raise to $8.75 an hour. To his neighbors and co-workers, James Poe was the ideal citizen. Like a great many Americans who have snapped and started a shooting spree, Poe was liked by his neighbors, well regarded at work, and seemed to be living an ordinary life. In the search to attach reason to unreasonable acts, no one here has said Poe seemed different or had odd habits. Instead, many echoed what Eugene Carr, who lived across the street from Poe, said: he was a nice person, he was a good person. But this normalcy was a carefully constructed mask hiding decades of accumulated rage and disappointment. The first crack in that mask appeared when his mother died 3 years before the shooting. After the death of his mother 3 years prior to the shootings, Poe was said to have emotionally changed for the worse, saying that he had nothing left to live for and arguing that he would take someone with him when he leaves this world. The woman who had been the center of his world, the person he had cared for since childhood when his father abandoned the family, was gone. For a man who had spent his entire life being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one everyone could count on, this loss shattered something fundamental inside him. Relatives described him as a recluse with no friends. After the death of his mother, 3 years prior to the shootings, Poe was said to have emotionally changed for the worse, saying that he had nothing left to live for and arguing that he would take someone with him when he leaves this world. His marriage to Teresa became the outlet for his growing rage. Frequently, he had violent outbursts, which were directed against his wife, Teresa, and twice he threatened her by putting a gun to her head. Picture the terror of living with someone who had already killed his best friend, who held a gun to your head and threatened to kill you. Teresa Poe was living with a time bomb, and she knew it. In January 1990, they separated as Teresa feared for her safety, and on March 2nd, she was granted an injunction that disallowed Poe's contacting her for a year. As a consequence, he withdrew even more and rarely socialized. In March, His wife obtained a court order prohibiting Poe from talking to her, writing, telephoning, or visiting for a year. In her petition, Teresa Poe said he had thrown a glass at her and tried to hurt her. Now Poe had lost the two most important people in his life, his mother to death and his wife to his own violence. The man who had always been reliable, always been responsible, always taken care of everyone else, was completely alone. And that's when his financial troubles became the final straw. In December 1988, Poe traded his old car for a 1988 Pontiac Grand Am, though he soon had difficulties making his payments. As a result, the car was voluntarily repossessed by the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, GMAC, in January 1990. He received a bill for $6,394, around $13,200 as of 2021, of outstanding fees in March, and again on April 6th, which was the last contact between him and the office. For most people, losing a car to repossession is embarrassing and financially difficult, but it's not the end of the world. For James Poe, a man who prided himself on being reliable and responsible, it was the ultimate humiliation. Here was someone who had never missed work, who always paid his bills, who had spent his entire life being the person others could depend on, and now he couldn't even keep up with his car payments. The debt wasn't just financial, it was existential. While Poe had already been on a killing rampage in the day before, killing a pimp, a prostitute, and wounding 2 teenagers, his anger at GMAS was apparently triggered by their efforts to collect a repossession deficiency balance on his auto loan account for $6,394. That bill represented everything that had gone wrong in his life, every loss, every failure, every moment when the world had proven that his reliability and responsibility meant nothing. About 2 months prior to the shootings, Poe purchased a Universal brand M1 carbine at a local pawn shop. This wasn't an impulse purchase. 2 months before the shooting, Poe was already planning violence. He was methodically acquiring the tools he would need to act on the rage that had been building inside him for years. The weekend before the GMAC shooting, Poe began his killing spree with a level of violence that shocked even seasoned investigators. Poe started his killing spree in the night of June 17th, 1990, at about 12:50 a.m. Armed with his blanket-wrapped M1 carbine, and not far from his home, he walked up to a group of men standing at a street corner in the northwest section of Jacksonville and killed Louis Carl Bacon with 2 shots in the chest before fleeing. A couple of minutes later, he attacked Doretta Drake, who was chatting with 2 other women in a vacant parking lot just 2 blocks from the first crime scene. After hitting Drake with his car, throwing her on the sidewalk, Poe stepped out of his Buick and killed her with a single shot to the head before driving away. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated brutality. Poe hit a woman with his car, then got out and executed her with a single shot to the head. A short time later, Poe also shot and wounded 2 youths, 17 and 18 years of age, after asking them for directions. A few blocks away, the youths, ages 17 and 18, were shot by a man who stopped his car and asked for directions. The 2, recovering from shoulder wounds, identified Poe as their attacker when they saw his picture on television after his rampage Monday, police said. The next morning, Poe's transformation from seemingly normal citizen to remorseless killer was complete. Later, on the morning of June 18th, Poe entered a convenience store, threatened the clerk with a pistol, and stating that he didn't have anything to lose, demanded all of the money in the register. After getting the money, he left. "I don't have anything to lose," he told the convenience store clerk. Those words reveal everything about Pow's mindset. He had given up any pretense of returning to normal life. He was a dead man walking, and he was determined to take as many people with him as possible. After robbing the convenience store, he visited his mother's grave one last time and then called his supervisor to state that he wouldn't be coming to work because he had something else to do. Even in his final hours, Poe maintained the facade of reliability, calling into work to explain his absence. The supervisor had no idea that the something else Poe had to do was commit mass murder. At about 10:44 a.m., Poe parked his car at the GMAC office located at 7870 Bay Meadows Way in Jacksonville. He entered the building through the front door armed with his M1 carbine, a Room RG 31.38 caliber revolver, several loaded magazines, and ammunition packed in his pockets. Picture the scene: a busy Monday morning at an auto loan office. Employees were drinking coffee, reviewing files, answering phones. Customers were coming in to make payments, some probably grumbling about their monthly bills, but dealing with the routine frustrations of modern life. Then James Poe walked through the front door, carrying enough firepower to kill everyone in the building. Without saying a word, he immediately began shooting with the M1 carbine at two customers at the front counter, killing Julia Burgess and wounding David Hendricks with 4 shots. Gilmore says that he shot customers Julia White Burgess, who died, and David Hendricks, who survived. Both customers had stopped by to make car payments. Julia Burgess and David Hendricks were just ordinary people doing ordinary things. They had driven to the GMAC office that morning to make their car payments, probably annoyed at having to take time out of their busy schedules for this mundane task. Julia Burgess would never make it home. David Hendricks survived, but would carry the physical and psychological scars of that morning for the rest of his life. Walking through the open office, he then systematically moved from desk to desk and shot at the GMAC workers, deliberately aiming at those hiding under their desks. Drew Woods was the first to be shot at his desk, followed by Cynthia Perry and Barbara Holland nearby, as well as Phyllis Griggs, who was injured. The word systematically is crucial here. This wasn't a frenzied outburst of violence. Poe moved through the office like a methodical executioner, going from desk to desk, hunting for victims who were trying to hide. And then we realized the guy was pointing his gun underneath people's desks and killing them one by one, he said. "I just saw the bottom of the carpet and prayed." Witnesses said Poe methodically went from desk to desk, firing his rifle. When the GMAC employees realized what was going on, many of them escaped through a back door of the building, while Poe started shooting at those ducking for cover. GMAC employees Janice David, Sharon Hall, Jewel Belote, Lee Simonton, Denise Highfill, Ron Echevarria, and Nancy Dill were also shot. These weren't just names on a police report. They were real people with families, dreams, and futures that ended in a hail of gunfire. "What a waste. What a damn waste," said Ray David, whose wife Janice died in the office massacre. The couple had 2 sons, ages 12 and 10. David, a lawyer, said he will bury his wife at a cemetery near their home, so he and the boys can bicycle to the gravesite. The 911 calls from that morning capture the absolute terror of people watching their coworkers being murdered. "There's a man in our office with a gun," a man's voice rasped on the 911 tape. Asked for details, the man dropped his voice, whispering, "It's a semi-automatic, definitely. He's still shooting. We're being killed. He's a black male with an AK-47, and he's killing everybody. He's still in there shooting everybody." "Come on," implored Barry Kimball, an employee who ran to a neighboring business to call for help. The desperation in these voices, the terror of people watching their friends and colleagues being murdered one by one, is almost unbearable to imagine. Numerous calls on the 911 tape illustrated the victim's terror as Poe moved about the office, poking a .30 caliber universal semi-automatic rifle under desks and shooting some of the victims 5 to 7 times. Poe wasn't just killing these people, he was ensuring they were dead, shooting them multiple times, making sure no one would survive to identify him or testify against him. Poe then put the .38 caliber revolver to his head and committed suicide. In just under 2 minutes, Poe had fired at the least 28 rounds from his carbine, hitting 11 of the 85 workers in the office as well as the 2 customers. 6 of his victims died at the scene, while another 3 died at hospital, the last being Jewel Belote, who succumbed to her wounds 9 days after the shooting. 2 minutes. In just 2 minutes, James Pogue had destroyed dozens of lives. 9 people were dead, 4 others were wounded, and the survivors would carry the trauma of that morning forever. Final police reports state that he fired 28 rounds in total. When police searched Poe's car, they discovered the true scope of what he had planned. When searching Poe's car, police recovered a loaded 9mm semi-automatic pistol, 2 magazines, and ammunition, as well as 12 pieces of nylon rope, each having a length of 24 inches, which led police to the assumption that Poe initially might have intended to take hostages. The rope suggests that Poe's original plan may have been even more horrific than what actually occurred. He may have intended to take hostages, to prolong the terror, to make his final act of violence last for hours instead of minutes. The fact that he had the foresight to bring rope shows just how carefully he had planned this massacre. At the time, the shooting at the GMAC office was the deadliest single mass shooting committed by a lone gunman in Florida history, and was later surpassed by the Orlando nightclub shooting on June 12th in 2016, in which 49 people were killed, and again on February 14th, 2018, by the Parkland school shooting, in which 17 people were killed. For 26 years, the GMAC shooting held the grim distinction of being Florida's worst mass shooting, a record that thankfully stood for over 2 decades. The aftermath of the shooting revealed just how successfully Poe had hidden his violent nature from those around him. Nathan D. Green, business agent at Poe's Union, Laborers Local 301, expressed shock, saying it was not the Poes I knew. Mary Trapp, who lived nearby, recalled Poe was always nice. This disconnect between the public Poe and the private monster is what makes his story so terrifying. Unlike the other killers we've examined in this series, Poe didn't exhibit obvious warning signs. He wasn't a drifter like Robert Silveria or a religious extremist like Joseph Burgess. He was the neighbor next door, the reliable coworker, the man who never missed work and always paid his bills on time. Mayor Tommy Hazouri called the shootings the darkest moment in Jacksonville history. It is every city's and every mayor's nightmare, he said. But the real nightmare wasn't just the shooting itself. It was the realization that someone could live among them for decades, seemingly normal and trustworthy, while harboring the capacity for such devastating violence. The story of James Edward Pogues forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the fragility of the social contract that holds our communities together. Here was a man who followed all the rules, who worked hard, who never caused trouble, who seemed to embody the values of American society. Yet beneath that facade was a rage so deep and so destructive that when it finally erupted, it destroyed 9 innocent lives in a matter of minutes. Poe's case also highlights the dangerous intersection of workplace violence, domestic abuse, and easy access to firearms. His history of threatening his wife with a gun, his financial troubles, and his ability to legally purchase weapons despite having killed his best friend in 1971 created a perfect storm of circumstances that led to tragedy. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how Poe's story reflects a type of American violence that has become all too familiar. The aggrieved individual who decides that if his world is falling apart, he will take innocent people with him. After the death of his mother 3 years prior to the shootings, Poe was said to have emotionally changed for the worse, saying that he had nothing left to live for and arguing that he would take someone with him when he leaves this world. This sentiment, this idea that personal failure justifies mass murder, has echoed through countless tragedies since 1990. Polk was one of the first to act on this twisted logic in such a spectacular way, but he certainly wasn't the last. His case helped establish the template for workplace violence that continues to plague American society today. The victims of James Edward Poe's rampage were more than just statistics. They were people with hopes, dreams, families, and futures that were cut short by one man's decision to transform his personal pain into public carnage. Julia Burgess, Janice David, Sharon Hall, Jewel Belode, Lee Simonton, Denise Highfill, Ron Echeverria, Nancy Dill, Drew Woods, Cynthia Perry, and Barbara Holland. Remember their names because they represent the human cost of a society that allows rage to fester unchecked and provides easy access to the tools of mass destruction. Today, the building that housed the GMAC office has been renovated and repurposed, but the memory of what happened there on that hot June morning in 1990 lingers. It serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears the face of the reliable neighbor, the good worker, the man who always says hello and never causes trouble, until the day he decides to destroy everything and everyone around him. James Edward Poe's legacy is not the reliable worker his neighbors thought they knew, but the devastating proof that monsters can hide behind the most ordinary facades. His story stands as a warning that we must pay attention to the signs of domestic violence, take threats seriously, and understand that the capacity for evil exists even in the most seemingly normal members of our communities. In our examination of forgotten killers, Poe represents perhaps the most terrifying type of all, the one who walks among us undetected, building rage and silence, until the moment he decides to let it explode into the lives of innocent people who never saw it coming. As we conclude our examination of James Edward Poe's horrific crimes, we turn our attention to another case that would prove just as devastating and shocking. In August of 1992, while investigators were still trying to understand the mindset that had driven Poe to his final act of violence, another tragedy was unfolding in the quiet suburbs of New Jersey. This time, the killer wasn't a construction worker pushed to his breaking point, but a respected college student whose carefully constructed facade of normalcy hid one of the most disturbing psychological profiles in criminal history. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born February 25th, 1963, and was an American serial killer and child molester who was on death row in federal prison following his conviction for the 2005 kidnappings and murders of members of the Groween family of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. But Duncan's crimes began much earlier than 2005, and his ability to blend into normal society while harboring the darkest of impulses would make him one of the most dangerous predators America had ever seen. Unlike the impulsive violence of James Pogue, Duncan's crimes were characterized by meticulous planning and a level of premeditation that revealed a mind completely devoid of empathy. Born in Tacoma, Washington, Duncan appeared to have every advantage in life. He was intelligent, articulate, and came from what outwardly seemed like a stable middle-class family. But beneath that promising exterior, something had gone fundamentally wrong. From an early age, Duncan exhibited behaviors that should have been warning signs to any adult paying attention. He tortured animals with a methodical precision that went far beyond typical childhood curiosity. He set fires, not in moments of anger, but as calculated experiments in destruction. Most disturbing of all, he began showing sexual interest in much younger children while he was still a child himself. The first documented incident that brought Duncan to the attention of authorities occurred when he was just 12 years old. In 1975, Duncan was arrested for raping a younger boy at gunpoint. Think about that for a moment. A 12-year-old child had already progressed to armed sexual assault. This wasn't experimentation or curiosity. This was predatory behavior that revealed a level of calculation and cruelty that most adults never reach. Instead of recognizing this as the red flag it should have been, the juvenile justice system treated it as an isolated incident. Duncan was sent to a youth facility for treatment, but the system completely failed to understand what they were dealing with. This wasn't a troubled child acting out. This was a developing psychopath learning to refine his methods. While in the juvenile facility, Duncan didn't improve or show remorse. Instead, he studied. He watched other inmates, learned what behaviors got rewarded and what got punished. He became a master manipulator, telling counselors exactly what they wanted to hear while privately planning his next attack. When he was released, everyone involved believed he had been successfully rehabilitated. They couldn't have been more wrong. Throughout his teenage years, Duncan continued his predatory behavior, but he became much more careful about avoiding detection. He learned to target children who were unlikely to report what happened to them, kids from broken homes or unstable situations who might not be believed. He studied his victims carefully, learning their routines and vulnerabilities before striking. By the time he reached adulthood, Duncan had perfected a terrifying combination of intelligence, charm, and absolute ruthlessness. He enrolled in college and maintained the facade of a normal student while continuing to prey on children. His professors described him as brilliant and engaged. His classmates saw him as quiet but friendly. None of them had any idea that they were sitting next to a monster. The internet became Duncan's hunting ground in ways that previous generations of predators could never have imagined. In the early days of online chat rooms and bulletin boards, Duncan discovered he could connect with vulnerable children from the safety of his computer. He could groom multiple victims simultaneously, building relationships over weeks or months before arranging to meet them in person. Duncan's online persona was carefully crafted to appeal to lonely, troubled children. He presented himself as understanding and sympathetic, someone who really listened to their problems when no one else would. He offered them the attention and affection they craved, slowly building their trust until they were willing to meet him face to face. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. What made Duncan particularly dangerous was his complete lack of boundaries or limits. While some predators focused on specific age groups or types of victims, Duncan was opportunistic. If a child was vulnerable and available, he was interested. So age, gender, location, none of it mattered to him. The only thing that mattered was whether he could get away with it. The Groween family massacre in 2005 represented the culmination of decades of violence and the moment when Duncan's carefully constructed double life finally collapsed. On May 16, 2005, Duncan invaded the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho home of Brenda Groen, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and her children. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. Duncan had been watching the family for weeks, studying their routines and planning his attack with military precision. He knew when the adults would be home, when the children would be alone, and how to get in and out of the house without being detected. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a calculated home invasion designed to give him access to the children. Using a hammer, Duncan brutally murdered Brenda Groen, Mark McKenzie, and 13-year-old Slade Groen. The violence was extreme and unnecessary for his ultimate goal, but it reveals something crucial about Duncan's psychology. He didn't just want to kidnap the children, he wanted to cause maximum trauma and suffering. The murders weren't obstacles to overcome, they were part of the pleasure he derived from the crime. 8-year-old Shasta Groen and 9-year-old Dylan Groen were kidnapped and taken to a remote campsite where Duncan subjected them to weeks of unspeakable abuse. The details of what those children endured are too disturbing to describe in full, but they reveal the true depths of Duncan's depravity. He videotaped his crimes, creating a permanent record of his victims' suffering that he could replay whenever he wanted. Dylan Groen did not survive his captivity. Duncan murdered the 9-year-old boy after weeks of torture and abuse, taking away a child who should have had decades of life ahead of him. The casual way Duncan ended Dylan's life, as if he were discarding a broken toy, shows the complete absence of humanity in his psychological makeup. Shasta Groen's survival was nothing short of miraculous. After 6 weeks in captivity, Duncan made the mistake of taking her to a restaurant in Coeur d'Alene. A waitress recognized Shasta from the missing person reports and called police. When officers arrived, they found Duncan calmly eating dinner with the traumatized 8-year-old girl he had kidnapped after murdering her family. Even after his arrest, Duncan showed no remorse for his crimes. In fact, he seemed proud of what he had accomplished. During interrogations, he provided detailed descriptions of his attacks with the clinical detachment of someone discussing the weather. He spoke about his victims as objects rather than human beings, showing a complete inability to recognize their humanity or suffering. The investigation into Duncan's background revealed a trail of victims stretching back decades. He confessed to numerous sexual assaults and murders across multiple states, though investigators believe the true number of his victims may never be known. Each confession was delivered with the same emotionless precision as if he were reading from a grocery list. What makes Duncan's case particularly disturbing is how long he was able to operate without being caught. For over 30 years, he moved through American society like a ghost, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while destroying the lives of countless children. He held jobs, attended school, even had relationships with adult women who never suspected what he was capable of. The technology that enabled many of Duncan's crimes also provided the evidence that finally brought him to justice. Computer forensics revealed thousands of images and videos documenting his abuse of children, creating an overwhelming case against him. The digital trail he left behind painted a picture of a predator who had been operating on a massive scale for decades. Duncan was ultimately sentenced to death for his federal crimes and multiple life sentences for his state convictions. He died in prison in 2021, taking with him the secrets of how many children he had victimized over his long career as a predator. His death brought closure to some families, but it could never undo the damage he had inflicted on his surviving victims. The case of Joseph Edward Duncan III forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how predators operate in our society. Unlike the explosive violence of James Poe, Duncan's crimes were characterized by patience, planning, and an ability to maintain a normal facade while committing the most heinous acts imaginable. He shows us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Duncan's victims were not random choices. They were carefully selected targets chosen for their vulnerability. He understood that children from unstable homes were less likely to be believed if they reported abuse. He knew that the internet gave him access to isolated, lonely kids who were desperate for attention and affection. His crimes were enabled by societal blind spots and technological tools that previous generations of predators could never have imagined. The families destroyed by Duncan's crimes will carry their trauma forever. The Growina family was shattered in a single night of violence that took away 3 lives and left the survivors with memories that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Shasta Groen, the little girl who survived 6 weeks of unimaginable horror, has shown remarkable courage in rebuilding her life, but she will always carry the scars of what Duncan did to her family. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the knowledge that Duncan was not unique. Across America, there are other predators using the same methods he perfected, hiding behind normal facades while targeting the most vulnerable members of our society. They study Duncan's techniques, learn from his mistakes, and adapt their methods to avoid detection. The internet has created new opportunities for predators to find and groom victims, but it has also created new tools for law enforcement to track and apprehend them. The same technology that enabled Duncan's crimes also provided the evidence that convicted him. Digital forensics and online monitoring have made it harder for predators to operate with impunity, but they continue to evolve and adapt. Education and awareness remain our best defenses against predators like Duncan. Children need to understand that adults who seem too interested in their problems, who want to keep their relationships secret, or who try to isolate them from their families, are displaying warning signs that should not be ignored. Parents and caregivers need to monitor their children's online activities and maintain open communication about potential dangers. The story of Joseph Edward Duncan III serves as a chilling reminder that some monsters are patient enough to wait decades for the perfect opportunity to strike. They don't wear masks or carry obvious weapons. They carry clipboards and wear friendly smiles. They volunteer at schools and youth organizations, positioning themselves where they will have access to potential victims. As we conclude this examination of forgotten killers, the cases of James Edward Poe and Joseph Edward Duncan III represent two different but equally terrifying faces of evil. Poe showed us how quickly a seemingly normal person can explode into violence when pushed to their breaking point. Duncan showed us how a calculating predator can operate in plain sight for decades, destroying countless lives while maintaining a facade of respectability. Both cases remind us that evil rarely announces itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it looks like the reliable coworker who never misses work. Sometimes it looks like the quiet college student who helps elderly neighbors with their groceries. The capacity for monstrous behavior exists in places we least expect it, hidden behind the most ordinary faces. These forgotten killers may not be household names, but their impact on the communities they terrorized and the families they destroyed is immeasurable. Their stories serve as warnings about the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would exploit our trust and vulnerability. In our final installment, we'll examine one more case that proves evil can hide behind any facade, in any profession, in any community, because the most dangerous predators are often those we least suspect, and the price of our complacency is measured in innocent lives. The tale of James Edward Poe stands as one of the most chilling examples of how workplace violence can escalate into unthinkable tragedy. James Edward "Pop" Poe was an American spree killer who killed 11 people in two separate attacks in Jacksonville, Florida on June 17th and 18th, 1990. Poe shot and killed two people at random on Jacksonville's north side, wounded two teenagers, and robbed a convenience store. Poe shot and killed 9 people and wounded 4 others at a General Motors Acceptance Corporation car loan office the next day before committing suicide. James Edward Poe was born on February 16, 1948, and was the first of 9 children. He was known by his neighbors as a quiet and nice man who kept a regular and fixed schedule, but also as someone who would become angry fairly quickly and get engaged in heated conversations, especially in matters concerning money and his car. Relatives described him as a recluse with no friends. The seeds of Poe's final violent outburst were planted decades earlier. In 1971, Poe shot and killed his best friend, David Lee Pender, during an argument outside a nightclub. James Edward Poe reached into his girlfriend's purse, grabbed her gun, and shot his friend, David Lee Pender, 3 times in the chest after he and Pender and their girlfriends left a nightclub and Pender called Poe's girlfriend a bitch. He had pleaded guilty to aggravated assault for shooting a man to death in 1971, but the judge allowed his record to be erased after 5 years probation. But Poe was not technically a convicted felon. Assistant State Attorney John Delaney said, "This legal loophole would prove devastating, allowing Poe to legally purchase firearms despite his history of violence." The immediate trigger for Poe's rampage was financial humiliation. In December 1988, Poe traded his old car for a 1988 Pontiac Grand Am, though he soon had difficulties making his payments. As a result, the car was voluntarily repossessed by the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, GMAX, in January 1990. He received a bill for $6,000 $394, around $13,200 as of 2021, of outstanding fees in March, and again on April 6th, which was the last contact between him and the office. But Poe's anger was fueled by more than just money problems. After the death of his mother 3 years prior to the shootings, Poe was said to have emotionally changed for the worse, saying that he had nothing left to live for and arguing that he would take someone with him when he leaves this world. Frequently, he had violent outbursts, which were directed against his wife, Teresa, and twice he threatened her by putting a gun to her head. In January 1990, they separated as Teresa feared for her safety, and on March 2nd, she was granted an injunction that disallowed Poe's contacting her for a year. As a consequence, he withdrew even more and rarely socialized. About 2 months prior to the shootings, Poe purchased a Universal brand M1 carbine at a local pawn shop. This wasn't an impulse purchase. Poe was methodically planning violence, stockpiling weapons while maintaining the facade of a normal life. For the past year, Poe, who went by the nickname Pop, had been doing construction maintenance at the Anheuser-Busch brewery for the WW Gay Construction Choksus. Separated from his wife, Teresa, Poe lived in a rundown duplex. The killing spree began on the night of June 17th, 1990. Poe started his killing spree in the night of June 17th, 1990, at about 12:50 a.m. Armed with his blanket-wrapped M1 carbine and not far from his home, he walked up to a group of men standing at a street corner in the northwest section of Jacksonville and killed Louis Carl Bacon with 2 shots in the chest before fleeing. Police said Poe had shot and killed a man and a woman Sunday in a prostitution-related dispute and wounded 2 teenagers about 10 minutes later. Police said Poe had shot and killed a man and a woman Sunday in a prostitution-related dispute and wounded 2 teenagers about 10 minutes later. A few blocks away, the youths, ages 17 and 18, were shot by a man who stopped his car and asked for directions. The 2, recovering from shoulder wounds, identified Poe as their attacker when they saw his picture on television after his rampage Monday, police said. The morning of June 18th marked the culmination of Poe's rage. After robbing the convenience store, he visited his mother's grave one last time and then called his supervisor to state that he wouldn't be coming to work because he had something else to do. Even in his final hours, Poe maintained the facade of responsibility, calling into work as if he were taking a sick day rather than preparing for mass murder. At about 10:44 a.m., Poe parked his car at the GMAC office located at 7870 Bay Meadows Way in Jacksonville. He entered the building through the front door armed with his M1 carbine, a Rohm RG 31.38 caliber revolver, several loaded magazines, and ammunition packed in his pockets. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. Without saying a word, he immediately began shooting with the M1 carbine at 2 customers at the front counter, killing Julia Burgess and wounding David Hendricks with 4 shots. First, he shot customers Julia White Burgess, who died, and David Hendricks, who survived. Both customers had stopped by to make a car payment. Julia Burgess and David Hendricks were simply ordinary people conducting routine business, unaware that they had walked into a death trap. Walking through the open office, he then systematically moved from desk to desk and shot at the GMAC workers, deliberately aiming at those hiding under their desks. Drew Woods was the first to be shot at his desk, followed by Cynthia Perry and Barbara Holland nearby, as well as Phyllis Griggs, who was injured. Sheriff James McMillan said Poe walked through shooting people execution style. The 911 calls from that morning capture the absolute terror of the moment. "There's a man in our office with a gun." A man's voice rasped on the 911 tape. "He has fired at several people." Asked for details, the man dropped his voice, whispering, "It's a semi-automatic, definitely. He's still shooting. We're being killed. He's a black male with an AK-47, and he's killing everybody. He's still in there shooting everybody, come on," implored Barry Kimball, an employee who ran to a neighboring business to call for help. Numerous calls on the 911 tape illustrated the victim's terror as Poe moved about the office, poking a .30 caliber universal semi-automatic rifle under desks and shooting some of the victims 5 to 7 times. When the GMACI employees realized what was going on, many of them escaped through a back door of the building, while Poe started shooting at those ducking for cover. GMAC employees Janice David, Sharon Hall, Jewel Beluggs, Lee Simonton, Denise Highfill, Ron Echevarria, and Nancy Dill were also shot. Poe then put the .38 caliber revolver to his head and committed suicide. In just under 2 minutes, Poe had fired at the least 28 rounds from his carbine, hitting 11 of the 85 workers in the office as well as the 2 customers. 6 of his victims died at the scene, while another 3 died at hospital, the last being Jewel Belote, who succumbed to her wounds 9 days after the shooting. When police searched Poe's car, they discovered evidence of an even more horrific plan. When searching Poe's car, police recovered a loaded 9mm semi-automatic pistol, 2 magazines, and ammunition, as well as 12 pieces of nylon rope, each having a length of 24 inches, which led police to the assumption that Poe initially might have intended to take hostages. The rope suggests that Poe's original plan may have been to prolong the terror, to take hostages, and make his final act of violence last for hours instead of minutes. At the time, the shooting at the GMAC office was the deadliest single mass shooting committed by a lone gunman in Florida history, and was later surpassed by the Orlando nightclub shooting on June 12, 2016, in which 49 people were killed, and again on February 14, 2018, by the Parkland school shooting, in which 17 people were killed. The aftermath revealed the tragic human cost of Poe's rage. "What a waste, what a damn waste," said Ray David, whose wife, Janice, died in the office massacre. The couple had 2 sons, ages 12 and 10. David, a lawyer, said he will bury his wife at a cemetery near their home so he and the boys can bicycle to the gravesite. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how normal Poe had appeared to those around him. Like a great many Americans who have snapped and started a shooting spree, Poe was liked by his neighbors, well regarded at work, and seemed to be living an ordinary life. In the search to attach reason to unreasonable acts, no one here has said Poe seemed different or had odd habits. Instead, many echoed what Eugene Carr, who lived across the street from Poe, said: "He was a nice person." Mayor Tommy Hazouri called the shootings the darkest moment in Jacksonville history. "It is every city's and every mayor's nightmare," he said. The GMAC shooting introduced America to a new type of terror, the workplace massacre committed by someone who seemed completely ordinary until the moment they decided to destroy everything around them. James Edward Poe's legacy is not the reliable worker his neighbors thought they knew, but the devastating proof that the capacity for mass violence can hide behind the most ordinary facade. His story serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who walk among us undetected, building rage and silence until the moment they decide to let it explode into the lives of innocent people who never saw it coming. The victims of Poe's rampage were more than statistics. They were people with hopes, dreams, families, and futures that were cut short by one man's decision to transform his personal failures into public carnage. Julia Burgess, Janice David, Sharon Hall, Jewel Belote, Lee Simonton, Denise Highfill, Ron Echevarria, Nancy Dill, Drew Woods, Cynthia Perry, Barbara Holland, and Louis Carl Bacon. Their names deserve to be remembered, not for how they died, but for the lives they lived and the families they left behind. In our final examination of these forgotten killers, we see that evil comes in many forms. Alfred Gainor stalked the vulnerable women of Springfield for years. Cleophas Prince Jr. shattered assumptions about racial targeting in his San Diego killing spree. Robert Silveria turned America's railway system into his personal hunting ground. Joseph Burgess used twisted religious beliefs to justify murder across decades. And James Poe proved that the most ordinary-seeming neighbor can harbor the capacity for devastating violence. These men remain relatively unknown compared to more famous killers, but their impact on the communities they terrorized was immeasurable. They remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic warnings or obvious red flags. Sometimes it wears the face of the reliable worker, the quiet neighbor, the helpful handyman. The lesson of these forgotten monsters is that vigilance is not paranoia, and that the price of ignoring warning signs is measured in innocent lives, lost to those who choose darkness over light. The scorching Florida sun beat down on Jacksonville in the summer of 1990 as the city sweltered through another typical June day. Across the sprawling metropolis, people went about their ordinary routines, paying bills, going to work, making car payments at auto loan offices. Nobody could have imagined that within hours, their peaceful community would be forever scarred by one of the most devastating mass shootings in Florida history. James Edward "Pop" Poe was an American spree killer who killed 11 people in 2 separate attacks in Jacksonville, Florida on June 17th and 18th, 1990. Poe shot and killed 2 people at random on Jacksonville's north side, wounded 2 teenagers, and robbed a convenience store. Poe shot and killed 9 people and wounded 4 others at a General Motors Acceptance Corporation car loan office the next day before committing suicide. The man who would soon become known as one of Florida's most deadly spree killers had lived among his neighbors for years, hiding his rage behind a facade of normalcy. James Edward Poe was born on February 16, 1948, and was the first of 9 children. To those who knew him, he seemed like just another working-class man trying to get by in a tough economy. He was known by his neighbors as a quiet and nice man who kept a regular and fixed schedule, but also as someone who would become angry fairly quickly and get engaged in heated conversations, especially in matters concerning money and his car. Relatives described him as a recluse with no friends. This isolation would prove to be a crucial factor in the tragedy that was about to unfold. The seeds of Poe's final violent outburst were planted decades earlier. In 1971, a young James Poe had committed an act of violence that should have been a warning sign to everyone around him. In 1971, James Edward Poe, reached into his girlfriend's purse, grabbed her gun, and shot his friend David Lee Pender 3 times in the chest after he and Pender and their girlfriends left a nightclub, and Pender called Poe's girlfriend a bitch. This wasn't a momentary loss of control or an accident. Poe had to make a conscious decision to reach for a weapon, aim it at his best friend, and pull the trigger 3 times. 3 separate choices to end the life of someone who knew him intimately. Yet the justice system failed catastrophically in its response to this clear demonstration of lethal violence. He had pleaded guilty to aggravated assault for shooting a man to death in 1971, but the judge allowed his record to be erased after 5 years probation. Under the law, convicted felons may not own firearms. But Poe was not technically a convicted felon, Assistant State Attorney John Delaney said. This legal loophole would prove deadly, allowing Poe to legally purchase the weapons he would later use to commit mass murder. For nearly 2 decades after killing his friend, Poe managed to maintain the appearance of a normal life. He worked steady jobs, primarily in construction and manual labor. For the past year, Poe, who went by the nickname Pop, had been doing construction maintenance at the Anheuser-Busch Brewery for the WW Gay Construction Co's. Separated from his wife, Teresa, Poe lived in a rundown duplex. But beneath this facade of working-class respectability, something dark was festering. After the death of his mother, 3 years prior to the shootings, Poe was said to have emotionally changed for the worse, saying that he had nothing left to live for and arguing that he would take someone with him when he leaves this world. The woman who had been the center of his world, the person he had cared for since childhood, was gone, and with her death, whatever human connections still anchored Poe to society began to dissolve. His marriage became the outlet for his growing rage and despair. Frequently, he had violent outbursts, which were directed against his wife, Teresa, and twice he threatened her by putting a gun to her head. In January 1990, they separated as Teresa feared for her safety, and on March 2nd, she was granted an injunction that disallowed Poe's contacting her for a year. As a consequence, he withdrew even more and rarely socialized. The final trigger for Poe's rampage was financial humiliation that cut to the core of his identity as a reliable, responsible man. In December 1988, Poe traded his old car for a 1988 Pontiac Grand Am, though he soon had difficulties making his payments. As a result, the car was voluntarily repossessed by the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, GMAC, in January 1990. He received a bill for $6,394, around $13,200 as of 2021, of outstanding fees in March, and again on April 6th, which was the last contact between him and the office. For a man who prided himself on being dependable and meeting his obligations, this repossession represented the ultimate failure. While Poe had already been on a killing rampage in the day before, killing a pimp, a prostitute, and wounding 2 teenagers, his anger at GMAC was apparently triggered by their efforts to collect a repossession deficiency balance on his auto loan account for $6,394. That bill wasn't just about money, it was about everything that had gone wrong in his life, every loss, every moment when his reliability and responsibility had proven meaningless. About 2 months prior to the shootings, Poe purchased a Universal brand M1 carbine at a local pawn shop. This wasn't an impulse purchase. 2 months before the shooting, Poe was already planning violence, methodically acquiring the tools he would need to act on the rage that had been building inside him for years. The weekend before the GMAC shooting would reveal the true scope of Poe's transformation into a remorseless killer. Poe started his killing spree in the night of June 17th, 1990, at about 12:50 a.m. Armed with his blanket-wrapped M1 carbine, and not far from his home, he walked up to a group of men standing at a street corner in the northwest section of Jacksonville and killed Louis Carl Bacon with 2 shots in the chest before fleeing. A man and woman police, believed to be a prostitute, and her pimp were killed within several blocks of each other early Saturday morning, both with a .30 caliber rifle. The woman was shot from a passing car, but the killer walked up to the man before firing, McMillan said. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated brutality. The different methods used for each victim showed that Poe was experimenting with murder, testing different approaches to killing. A few blocks away, the youths, ages 17 and 18, were shot by a man who stopped his car and asked for directions. The two, recovering from shoulder wounds, identified Poe as their attacker when they saw his picture on television after his rampage Monday, police said. The casual way Poe asked for directions before shooting these teenagers shows the complete disconnection from normal human emotion that had taken hold of him. The morning of June 18th marked the culmination of Poe's rage. After committing robbery and visiting his mother's grave one final time, he made a phone call that revealed his methodical nature even in his final hours. After robbing the convenience store, he visited his mother's grave one last time and then called his supervisor to state that he wouldn't be coming to work because he had something else to do. Even as he prepared for mass murder, Poe maintained the facade of responsibility, calling into work as if he were taking a sick day. At about 10:44 a.m., Poe parked his car at the GMAC office, located at 7870 Bay Meadows Way in Jacksonville. He entered the building through the front door, armed with his M1 carbine, a Rohm RG 31.38 caliber revolver, several loaded magazines, and ammunition packed in his pockets. Picture the scene: a busy Monday morning at an auto loan office. Employees were drinking coffee, reviewing files, answering phones. Customers were coming in to make payments, probably grumbling about their monthly bills, but dealing with the routine frustrations of modern life. Then James Poe walked through the front door, carrying enough firepower to kill everyone in the building. Without saying a word, he immediately began shooting with the M1 carbine at 2 customers at the front counter, killing Julia Burgess and wounding David Hendricks with 4 shots. First, he shot customers Julia White Burgess, who died, and David Hendricks, who survived. Both customers had stopped by to make a car payment. Julia Burgess and David Hendricks were just ordinary people doing ordinary things, unaware that they had walked into a death trap. Walking through the open office, he then systematically moved from desk to desk and shot at the GMAC workers, deliberately aiming at those hiding under their desks. Drew Woods was the first to be shot at his desk, followed by Cynthia Perry and Barbara Holland nearby, as well as Phyllis Griggs, who was injured. The word systematically is crucial here. Witnesses said Poe methodically went from desk to desk, firing his rifle. This wasn't a frenzied outburst of violence. Sheriff James McMillan said Poe walked through shooting people execution style. Poe moved through the office like a methodical executioner, going from desk to desk, hunting for victims who were trying to hide. The 911 calls from that morning capture the absolute terror of people watching their coworkers being murdered. "There's a man in our office with a gun," a man's voice rasped on the 911 tape. "He has fired at several people." Asked for details, the man dropped his voice, whispering, "It's a semi-automatic, definitely." "He's still shooting. We're being killed. He's a black male with an AK-47, and he's killing everybody." "He's still in there shooting everybody." "Come on," implored Barry Kimball, an employee who ran to a neighboring business to call for help. The desperation in these voices, the terror of people watching their friends and colleagues being murdered one by one, is almost unbearable to imagine. Numerous calls on the 911 tape illustrated the victim's terror as Pow moved about the office, poking a .30 caliber universal semi-automatic rifle under desks and shooting some of the victims 5 to 7 times. Poe wasn't just killing these people, he was ensuring they were dead, shooting them multiple times, making sure no one would survive to identify him or testify against him. When the GMAC employees realized what was going on, many of them escaped through a back door of the building, while Pogue started shooting at those ducking for cover. GMAC employees Janice David, Sharon Hall, Jewel Belote, Lee Simonton, Denise Highfill, Ron Echevarria, and Nancy Dill were also shot. Pow then put the .38 caliber revolver to his head and committed suicide. In just under 2 minutes, Poe had fired at the least 28 rounds from his carbine, hitting 11 of the 85 workers in the office as well as the 2 customers. 6 of his victims died at the scene, while another 3 died at hospital, the last being Jewel Belote, who succumbed to her wounds 9 days after the shooting. 2 minutes? Final police reports state that he fired 28 rounds in total. In just 2 minutes, James Polk had destroyed dozens of lives. 9 people were dead, 4 others were wounded, and the survivors would carry the trauma of that morning forever. When police searched Poe's car, they discovered evidence of an even more horrific plan. When searching Poe's car, police recovered a loaded 9mm semi-automatic pistol, 2 magazines, and ammunition, as well as 12 pieces of nylon rope, each having a length of 24 inches, which led police to the assumption that Poe initially might have intended to take hostages. The rope suggests that Poe's original plan may have been even more terrifying than what actually occurred. He may have intended to take hostages, to prolong the terror, to make his final act of violence last for hours instead of minutes. At the time, the shooting at the GMAC office was the deadliest single mass shooting committed by a lone gunman in Florida history, and was later surpassed by the Orlando nightclub shooting on June 12, 2016, in which 49 people were killed, and again on February 14, 2018, by the Parkland school shooting, in which 17 people were killed. For 26 years, the GMAC shooting held the grim distinction of being Florida's worst mass shooting. The aftermath revealed just how successfully Poe had hidden his violent nature from those around him. Nathan D. Green, business agent at Poe's union, Laborers Local 301, expressed shock, saying it was not the Poe I knew. Mary Trapp, who lived nearby, recalled Poe was always nice. Like a great many Americans who have snapped and started a shooting spree, Poe was liked by his neighbors, well regarded at work, and seemed to be living an ordinary life. In the search to attach reason to unreasonable acts, no one here has said Poe seemed different or had odd habits. Instead, Many echoed what Eugene Carr, who lived across the street from Poe, said. He was a nice person. He was a good person. Mayor Tommy Hazouri called the shootings the darkest moment in Jacksonville history. It is every city's and every mayor's nightmare, he said. But the real nightmare wasn't just the shooting itself. It was the realization that someone could live among them for decades, seemingly normal and trustworthy, while harboring the capacity for such devastating violence. The human cost of Poe's rampage was immeasurable. What a waste, what a damn waste, said Ray David, whose wife, Janice, died in the Office massacre. The couple had 2 sons, ages 12 and 10. David, a lawyer, said he will bury his wife at a cemetery near their home so he and the boys can bicycle to the gravesite. The victims were identified as Julia W. Burgess, Drew Woods, Cynthia Perry, Barbara Holland, Sharon Hall, Lee Simonton, Janice David, and Denise Highfill, the wife of a Jacksonville police officer. These weren't just names on a police report. They were real people with families, dreams, and futures that ended in a hail of gunfire. The story of James Edward Poe forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the fragility of the social contract that holds our communities together. Here was a man who followed all the rules for most of his life, who worked hard, who never caused trouble in his neighborhood, who seemed to embody the values of American society. Yet beneath that facade was a rage so deep and so destructive that when it finally erupted, it destroyed 9 innocent lives in a matter of minutes. According to friend and former neighbor Vanessa Gadsden, Poe changed after his mother's death 3 years ago. After his mama was dead, he said he didn't have anything to live for, said Gadsden, according to the Miami Herald. He always said, when he leaves this world, he was going to take someone with him. This sentiment has echoed through countless tragedies since 1990. Poe was one of the first to act on this twisted logic in such a spectacular way, helping establish the template for workplace violence that continues to plague American society today. His case proved that some of the most dangerous killers are those who appear to be ordinary citizens until the moment they decide that if their world is ending, they will take innocent people with them. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how Poe's story reflects a type of American violence that has become all too familiar. The aggrieved individual who decides that personal failure justifies mass murder. His ability to hide his true nature for decades while living as a seemingly normal member of society makes him one of the most terrifying killers in this series. Today, the building that housed the GMAC office has been renovated and repurposed, but the memory of what happened there on that hot June morning in 1990 lingers. It serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears the face of the reliable neighbor, the good worker, the man who always says hello and never causes trouble, until the day he decides to destroy everything and everyone around him. James Edward Poe's legacy is not the reliable worker his neighbors thought they knew, but the devastating proof that monsters can hide behind the most ordinary facades. His story stands as a warning that we must pay attention to the signs of domestic violence, take threats seriously, and understand that the capacity for evil exists even in the most seemingly normal members of our communities. We've reached the end of our journey through the darkest corners of American criminal history. As the smoke clears from the GMAC office that summer morning in 1990, we're left to contemplate the devastating reality that monsters often hide behind the most ordinary facades. James Edward Poe killed 11 people in 2 separate attacks in Jacksonville, Florida, shooting and killing 9 people and wounding 4 others at a General Motors Acceptance Corporation car loan office before committing suicide. Like a great many Americans who have snapped and started a shooting spree, Poe was liked by his neighbors, well regarded at work, and seemed to be living an ordinary life. Many echoed what Eugene Carr, who lived across the street from Poe, said. He was a nice person. He was a good person. The story of James Edward Poe brings our examination of forgotten killers full circle, proving that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic warnings or obvious red flags. In just under 2 minutes, Poe had fired at least 28 rounds from his carbine, hitting 11 of the 85 workers in the office, as well as the 2 customers. 2 minutes that destroyed dozens of lives and shattered a community's sense of safety forever. What makes these forgotten monsters so terrifying isn't their body counts or their methods, but their ability to blend seamlessly into society while harboring the capacity for devastating violence. Alfred Gainor worked as a handyman, living quietly among his neighbors for years while stalking vulnerable women in Springfield. Cleophas Prince Jr. served in the Navy and seemed like a model citizen until his cross-racial killing spree terrorized San Diego. Robert Silveria rode America's railways for decades, appearing to be just another drifter while murdering fellow train riders across 38 states. Joseph Burgess lived in religious communes, quoting scripture even as he planned executions of unmarried couples. And James Poe showed up to work every day, maintained his home, and paid his bills, all while the rage that would fuel his final rampage grew inside him. After the death of his mother, 3 years prior to the shootings, Poe was said to have emotionally changed for the worse, saying that he had nothing left to live for and arguing that he would take someone with him when he leaves this world. Frequently, he had violent outbursts, which were directed against his wife, Teresa, and twice he threatened her by putting a gun to her head. In January 1990, they separated as Teresa feared for her safety. These forgotten killers remind us that vigilance is not paranoia, and that the price of ignoring warning signs is measured in innocent lives, lost to those who choose darkness over light. They operated in society's blind spots, preying on the vulnerable, the forgotten, the marginalized. They exploited our assumptions about who could be dangerous and who seemed safe. What a waste, what a damn waste, said Ray David, whose wife, Janice, died in the office massacre. The couple had 2 sons, ages 12 and 10. David, a lawyer, said he will bury his wife at a cemetery near their home so he and the boys can bicycle to the gravesite. The victims of these crimes were more than statistics. They were people with hopes, dreams, families, and futures that were cut short by individuals who decided that their personal failures justified taking innocent lives. Behind every name on these lists of victims was a human being who mattered, who was loved, who deserved better than to become a footnote in the story of someone else's evil. As we conclude this examination of the most evil serial killers you've never heard of, we're left with uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the fragility of the social bonds that hold our communities together. These killers may not be household names, but their impact on the families they destroyed and the communities they terrorized was immeasurable. At the time, the shooting at the GMAC office was the deadliest single mass shooting committed by a lone gunman in Florida history and was later surpassed by the Orlando nightclub shooting on June 12, 2016, in which 49 people were killed, and again on February 14th, 2018, by the Parkland school shooting. Their stories serve as warnings about the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would exploit our trust and vulnerability. The capacity for monstrous behavior exists in places we least expect it, hidden behind the most ordinary faces, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to reveal itself. The lesson of these forgotten monsters is clear. Evil rarely announces itself with grand gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it looks like the reliable coworker who never misses work. Sometimes it appears as the quiet neighbor who keeps a regular schedule. Sometimes it wears the face of someone who seems completely ordinary until the moment they decide to destroy everything around them. In remembering these killers, we honor their victims by refusing to let their stories be forgotten, by learning from the warning signs that were missed, and by understanding that the price of our complacency is always measured in innocent blood. The most evil serial killers you've never heard of prove that monsters walk among us every day, and only by acknowledging the truth can we hope to protect ourselves and those we love from becoming their next victims.